Alright, let's talk about Charles Dickens, one of the most powerful voices of the Victorian age, the man who turned storytelling into social conscience. Dickens was born near Portsea, the second of 8 children. His father worked in the Navy office, and just like one of Dickens's later characters, Mr. Micawber, he was constantly in debt. Yes, that's an important exam detail. Because of these family troubles, young Charles had a difficult childhood. He was a delicate boy, but he loved books. He devoured the works of Smollett, Fielding, and Lesage, all of whom shaped his vivid narrative style. When his family moved to London in 1823, things got worse. His father was imprisoned for debt in Marshalsea prison, and little Charles, barely 12, had to work in a blacking factory pasting labels on bottles to help support the family. It was an experience that scarred him but also inspired many of his novels about childhood poverty and injustice. When the family situation improved, Dickens returned to school, and by 1827 he was working as a clerk in an attorney's office. But his real gift was for observation and language. He taught himself shorthand and became a reporter, traveling across England by stagecoach and writing for newspapers like the Morning Chronicle. That fact, too, has been asked in exam. His first literary success came in 1833 when he published Sketches by Bose in the Monthly Magazine, another exam favorite. These lively sketches of London life quickly made him a name to watch. Then came 1836 and the birth of the Pickwick Papers. He began it as a series of comic pieces for a publisher, originally to accompany sporting illustrations. But when the first illustrator, Seymour, died, Fiz took over and the series exploded in popularity. By the time the Pickwick Papers ended, Dickens was a national celebrity. From that point on, his career never slowed down. He became, quite literally, the first literary superstar, his fame even outshining Sir Walter Scott's, and his readership extending across the English-speaking world. Dickens also had a restless spirit. He traveled widely to America, Italy, Switzerland, and back to America again. His travels inspired books like American Notes and Pictures from Italy, and yes, those trips have been asked in exam. By 1846, Dickens was editing the Daily News, and he later founded 2 hugely successful magazines, Household Words in 1849 and All the Year Round in 1859, both major exam points. These magazines published not only his own serialized novels but also the works of other writers, giving voice to the social and moral issues of Victorian England. In 1858, Dickens began his famous public readings, and they weren't simple readings, they were performances. He would act out scenes from Oliver Twist or A Christmas Carol with full dramatic energy. The audiences loved them, but the intensity of these tours physically exhausted him. His American readings were especially popular and financially rewarded. Dickens eventually settled at Gad's Hill Place, a beautiful home near Rochester, a house he had admired as a child. It became his retreat, his writing den, and finally the place where he died in 1870. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, a place reserved for England's literary giants. Across his career, Dickens gave us unforgettable works: Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Bleak House, Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities, and Hard Times. Each one combines humor, pathos, and sharp social criticism, exposing issues like child labor, class inequality, and the cruelty of institutions. He didn't just tell stories, he gave a human face to the suffering of the poor and held up a mirror to Victorian society. His characters, from Scrooge to Oliver, from Miss Havisham to Mr. Pickwick, still live in our imagination because they are both real and timeless. And here's a fun side note that's sometimes asked in exam. The Man Who Liked Dickens is a short story by Evelyn Waugh, inspired by Dickens's continuing cultural impact long after his death. So, in short, Charles Dickens began as a poor factory working boy and became the most beloved writer of his time. His stories entertained millions but also changed the moral conscience of a nation. Truly, Dickens was and still is the beating heart of Victorian England. His early works, The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, and Nicholas Nickleby, marked the beginning of a career filled with humor, humanity, and social truth. We'll start with The Pickwick Papers, published between 1836 and 37. The full title, and remember this for exam, is The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club. Dickens published it under the pseudonym Boss, the name he used for his early sketches. The series was first intended to accompany illustrations by Robert Seymour, a caricaturist, though after Seymour's death, another artist, Phiz, continued the work. At the heart of the novel is Samuel Pickwick, Esquire, a kind, wealthy, and delightfully naive old gentleman who travels with his friends on comical adventures as part of the Pickwick Club. That detail his role as the founder of the Pickwick Club has been asked in exam. The book is packed with humor, warmth, and eccentric characters like Sam Weller, whose streetwise wit perfectly balances Mr. Pickwick's innocence. What started as a simple comic serial soon became a national phenomenon. Readers adored it. Pickwick wasn't just a success, it made Dickens a household name. Now, let's move to his darker, more serious novel, Oliver Twist. Published serially from 1837 to 39, it's one of Dickens's most famous social commentaries. The full book appeared in 3 volumes in 1838, and it carried the alternate title The Parish Boy's Progress, a reference to Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which has been asked in exam. The story follows Oliver, a poor orphan born in a workhouse and raised on starvation rations. When he dares to ask for more food, "Please, sir, I want some more," he's sent off as an apprentice to an undertaker. But after constant mistreatment, he runs away to London, where fate takes a dangerous turn. There he meets the street-smart Artful Dodger, a young pickpocket who introduces him to Fagin, the sinister old man who trains orphan boys to steal. Both names, the Dodger and Fagin, are among Dickens's most memorable creations and have been asked repeatedly in exams. Oliver is wrongly accused of theft after a handkerchief is stolen, but the kind Mr. Brownlow takes him in. Fagin, however, fears Oliver will expose the gang, so he sends the tragic Nancy to lure him back. Nancy, torn between loyalty and goodness, secretly reveals Fagin's plot to Rose Maylie, an act of courage that costs her life. She's brutally murdered by her lover, Bill Sykes, a scene often noted in exam questions. The ending ties up the secrets. Monks, revealed as Oliver's half-brother, tries to destroy him to secure their father's fortune. But the truth comes out. Oliver inherits his rightful wealth, Fagin is executed, and Oliver finally finds peace in the countryside with Mr. Brownlow and the Maylies. Every one of those key details, Monks's identity, Fagin's hanging, and Oliver's inheritance have appeared in exam questions. Then comes Nicholas Nickleby, Dickens's third novel, serialized between 1838 and 39. The full title is Gloriously Long, The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby, containing a faithful account of the fortunes, misfortunes, uprisings, downfallings, and complete career of the Nickleby family, and yes, that's been asked in exam too. The story follows Nicholas Nickleby, a spirited 19-year-old who's left penniless after his father's death and must provide for his mother and sister, Kate. With few options, Nicholas takes a teaching job at Dorothy Boys Hall, a cruel Yorkshire boarding school run by the abusive Wackford Squeers. There, he befriends Mike, a poor, mistreated boy, and this friendship becomes one of the novel's most touching elements. Nicholas's main antagonist is his cold-hearted uncle, Ralph Nickleby, a man driven by greed and manipulation. Throughout the story, Nicholas defends the helpless, exposes cruelty, and slowly rebuilds his family's fortune, proving Dickens's enduring theme that goodness and courage will always outshine corruption. Taken together, these 3 novels show Dickens's full range. Pickwick with its laughter and charm, Oliver Twist with its grim realism and social protest, and Nicholas Nickleby with its blend of sentiment and satire. They also mark the evolution of Dickens himself from Bose, the witty observer of everyday London, to the great moral storyteller who would give voice to the forgotten poor. Next, The Old Curiosity Shop, 1840-41. This touching novel was one of two long stories Dickens published in his weekly serial Master Humphrey's Clock, the other being Barnaby Rudge, and yes, that's a detail often asked in exam. The novel tells the heartbreaking story of Nell Trent, a gentle orphan who lives with her grandfather in the old curiosity shop in London, another key exam fact. Her grandfather loves her dearly but has a fatal flaw. He's addicted to gambling. Hoping to secure a future for Nell, he gambles away all their savings and falls into the clutches of Daniel Quilp, a cruel and grotesque moneylender. His name, too, is a frequent exam reference. When Quilp seizes the shop, Nell and her grandfather flee into the countryside, facing poverty, hunger, and exhaustion. Friends search for them but fail to find them in time. The journey turns tragic when Nell dies from sheer exhaustion, and her heartbroken grandfather dies beside her, one of the most emotional endings in Victorian fiction, and a line that's been asked in exam. This novel deeply moved readers when it first appeared. People reportedly wept over Nell's death, proving Dickens's unmatched power to stir public feeling. Now, Barnaby Rudge. Full title: Barnaby Rudge. A Tale of the Riots of '80 is Dickens's first historical novel, and yes, that's an exam favorite. It's set against the backdrop of the Gordon riots, when London erupted in anti-Catholic violence, another point that's often tested. The story follows Barnaby, a simple-minded but good-hearted young man who's swept up in the chaos of the riots. His mother desperately tries to save him from the violent mob, and by the end, Barnaby finds peace and redemption. It's not just a tale of riot and fire, it's Dickens exploring how easily ordinary people can be manipulated into cruelty by fear and fanaticism. In other words, it's as much about the crowd as it is about the individual. And now, the timeless masterpiece, A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. That's the full title, and it's been asked in exam multiple times. Written and published in just a few weeks in 1843, it became one of the most beloved Christmas stories in all of literature. Dickens poured his social conscience and moral imagination into it. At its center is Ebenezer Scrooge, a wealthy but miserly old man who despises Christmas, another exam essential. He rejects generosity, compassion, and even family. But one Christmas Eve, he is visited by the ghost of Jacob Marley, his dead business partner, who warns him that greed and selfishness will doom his soul. That's another exam highlighted moment. Then come the three spirits, the ghosts of Christmas, past, present, and future, who show Scrooge the truth about his life. The ghost of Christmas past reminds him of his lost innocence and love. The ghost of Christmas present reveals how others, including the poor Tiny Tim, suffer yet remain joyful and generous. Tiny Tim, by the way, symbolizes childlike goodness and innocence, and yes, that's a key exam symbol. Finally, the ghost of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge his own lonely death, unloved and unmourned. Terrified, Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning transformed. He becomes kind, generous, and full of joy, helping others, spreading cheer, and becoming almost a symbol of rebirth. Through this short novel, Dickens didn't just create a festive story, he created a moral fable about compassion, redemption, and the power of change. No wonder it's still read, performed, and quoted every Christmas around the world. Alright, first up is Martin Chuzzlewit, whose full title is The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. Now, this one has been asked in exam, and it's often remembered for its unforgettable characters, especially the hypocritical architect Pecksniff and the eccentric nurse Mrs. Gamp, whose very name gave us the English slang word gamp for an umbrella. The story follows young Martin Chuzzlewit, who quarrels with his wealthy grandfather and sets off to make his own fortune in America. The scenes in America are classic Dickens satire filled with biting humor about American greed and pretension. But life there is far from easy. Martin and his cheerful companion Mark Tapley face disease, swarm fever, and starvation before returning to England wiser than before. Back home, Martin uncovers fraud and hypocrisy within his own family. eventually reconciling with his grandfather and inheriting his fortune. Like many of Dickens's novels, it's both moral and comic, showing that true worth comes not from wealth but from humility and integrity. Next comes Dombey and Son, another major novel, and don't forget its full title, Dealings with the Firm of Dombey and Son, Wholesale, Retail and for Exportation. That full title has been asked in exam. The novel opens with Mr. Dombey, a cold, proud businessman who is obsessed with having a son to continue his firm. When his son, Paul Dombey Jr., is born, Dombey feels immense pride. That too has been a frequent exam question, but tragedy soon follows. His wife dies and his beloved son grows frail and dies young. Dombey completely neglects his daughter Florence, who, despite her father's indifference, loves him deeply. Later, Dombey marries Edith, a strong and independent woman, but their marriage collapses when she runs away with his cunning employee, Mr. Carker. Eventually, Carker dies in an accident, Dombey's business fails, and his fortune crumbles. In the end, it's Florence, the very daughter he once ignored, who returns to care for him. The novel closes with reconciliation, father and daughter united in forgiveness. Dickens uses Dombey's downfall to explore pride, materialism, and redemption, all wrapped in the human warmth typical of his storytelling. Now we come to Dickens's most beloved novel, David Copperfield. Its full title is The Personal History of David Copperfield, and Dickens famously called it his favorite child. That affectionate remark has been asked in exam more than once. This novel is partly autobiographical, drawing from Dickens's own difficult childhood. It's also known as a Künstlerroman, or a novel about the growth of an artist, another exam term you should remember. The story begins with David's birth after the death of his father. His kind mother remarries the cruel and controlling Mr. Murdstone, whose tyranny makes young David's life miserable, again a common exam question. After his mother's death, David is sent to work in London, where he boards with the eternally optimistic but poor Mr. Micawber, modelled after Dickens's own father. Eventually, David runs away to live with his eccentric Aunt Betsy Trotwood, who becomes his guardian. That escape is one of the turning points of the novel. Under her care, he grows up, studies law, and becomes a writer. Along the way, he meets Steerforth, a charming but morally weak friend whose betrayal leads to the ruin of little Emily, one of the novel's tragic threats. David marries the sweet but childish Dora Spenlow, who dies young. He later realizes that his true love has always been Agnes Wickfield, whose quiet strength anchors the story. And, of course, Dickens gives us one of his greatest villains, the slimy Uriah Heep, who manipulates Mr. Wickfield until David exposes his fraud. Both Uriah's schemes and David's exposure of him have been frequently asked in exams. In the end, David matures both as a man and as a writer, marrying Agnes and achieving emotional peace. Now, Bleak House might just be Dickens at his most ambitious. The story is partly told by Esther Summerson, the novel's gentle heroine, and partly by an omniscient narrator. That dual narrative style has been asked in exam. At the heart of the story lies the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case, a long, tangled legal dispute in the Court of Chancery. This lawsuit over an inheritance drags on for generations until, ironically, all the money is eaten up by legal costs. Yes, that's another common exam point. Esther, an orphan raised by the stern Miss Barbary, comes to live at Bleak House with her guardian, John Jarndyce. There, she befriends the sweet Ada Clare and her cousin, Richard Carstone. But Richard becomes obsessed with the Jarndyce inheritance and ruins himself financially and spiritually chasing it. Meanwhile, Dickens introduces us to Lady Dedlock, a proud aristocrat hiding a terrible secret. She is actually Esther's mother. That revelation, too, has been asked in exam. The sinister lawyer, Mr. Tulkinghorn, uncovers her secret and uses it to control her. But before he can expose her, he is murdered, an early and powerful example of the detective story in English fiction. The case is investigated by Inspector Bucket, one of literature's first detectives, and through him, Dickens gives us a thrilling blend of mystery and social critique. When Lady Dedlock's secret comes out, she flees in shame and guilt, only for Esther to find her body near the graveyard, one of Dickens's most tragic scenes. The novel ends with Richard's death and the lawsuit finally collapsing. Esther, at last, finds happiness and peace when she marries Dr. Alan Woodcote, another important exam point. Bleak House isn't just a story. It's Dickens's powerful attack on the corrupt legal system, the hypocrisy of society, and the cruelty of bureaucracy. Now let's move to Hard Times. Serialized in Dickens's magazine Household Words, and yes, that publication detail has been asked in exam. This novel is Dickens's sharpest critique of industrialization and the mechanical way of life that it produces. It's set in the grim manufacturing town of Coketown, where everything from factories to education runs on rigid principles of utility and profit. Here we meet Mr. Thomas Gradgrind, a schoolmaster who believes only in facts, not imagination, a phrase often quoted and definitely exam relevant. He raises his children, Louisa and Tom, to suppress emotion and creativity. Into their lives enters Sissy Jupe, a circus girl whose warmth and compassion offer a counterpoint to Gradgrind's cold rationalism, another key exam detail. Louisa is married off to Mr. Bounderby, a boastful factory owner many years her senior, while her brother Tom works in Bounderby's bank, growing resentful and bitter. Meanwhile, Dickens gives us one of his most sympathetic working class characters, Stephen Blackpool, a humble mill worker trapped in an unhappy marriage and persecuted by both factory owners and fellow workers. His storyline exposes the dehumanizing side of industrial capitalism, and yes, Stephen Blackpool's name is often tested in exam. When the bank is robbed, Stephen is framed for the crime. The real thief turns out to be Tom Gradgrind, and that revelation shatters Louisa's already joyless world. She finally confronts her father, forcing him to realize that life without imagination and compassion is empty. By the end, Tom flees into exile, Louisa seeks a new life guided by emotional truth, and Gradgrind himself begins to change, realizing that facts alone can never sustain a human heart. And finally, Little Dorrit. This novel circles back to Dickens's lifelong theme, poverty, debt, and imprisonment, something he understood personally. The story follows Amy Dorrit, who is born and raised in Marshalsea Debtors' Prison. Yes, the same prison where Dickens's own father was confined. That fact always comes up in exams. Her father, William Dorrit, has been imprisoned for debt for so long that he's almost become a local celebrity within the jail. Amy, kind and self-sacrificing, works as a seamstress to support him. The other main character, Arthur Clenham, returns to London after years in China, trying to uncover a mystery about his family's past. He meets Amy and becomes drawn to her honesty and innocence. Through him, we move between the worlds of poverty and wealth, exposing how greed and corruption infect every level of society. Eventually, Arthur helps discover a hidden inheritance that frees the Dorrit family from prison. Suddenly wealthy, they travel through Europe, but their newfound fortune brings them little happiness. Mr. Dorrit dies abroad, never escaping the shadow of debt in his mind. Later, Arthur himself suffers financial ruin and ironically ends up in the Marshalsea prison, where Amy visits him faithfully. In the novel's deeply moving conclusion, they marry, finding peace, humility, and moral redemption in each other's love. Let's dive into two of Charles Dickens's most powerful novels, A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations. Both came late in his career and both capture Dickens at his emotional and moral best. Set in the late 18th century during the French Revolution, A Tale of Two Cities gives us one of Dickens's most dramatic, fast-paced narratives. And yes, its French Revolution backdrop has been asked in exam. Dickens actually drew his inspiration from Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution, a history, another key exam point. He admired Carlyle's intensity, though Dickens preferred drama over strict historical accuracy. The result? A vivid picture of chaos and sacrifice full of mobs, prisons, and guillotines. The title, of course, refers to London and Paris, the two cities where the story unfolds again, an often asked fact. Fun trivia. The subtitle of David Lodge's Changing Places, A Tale of Two Campuses is a clever nod to Dickens's novel, and that intertextual reference has also been asked in exam. Now, here's how the plot unfolds. Dr. Manette, once imprisoned in the Bastille for 18 years, is freed and reunited with his daughter Lucy Manette. She is compassionate and gentle, the moral center of the book. Lucy falls in love with Charles Darnay, a French aristocrat who rejects his family's cruelty and settles in London. That detail too comes up in exams. But here enters Sidney Carton, a jaded, brilliant lawyer who secretly loves Lucy. His love gives his life meaning. When Darnay returns to France and is imprisoned during the Revolution, Carton performs one of the most moving acts in literature. He sacrifices his life to save Darnay, taking his place at the guillotine. His final words, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done," remain immortal. Lucy, Darnay, and their family escape safely to England, while Carton redeems his wasted life through love and sacrifice. It's worth noting that Dickens may have borrowed elements from Watts Phillips's play The Dead Heart, a connection that sparked rumors of plagiarism, and from works like Bulwer Lytton's Zanoni and Lewis's The Castle Spectre. These influences, along with Arthur Young's travels in France and accounts from the Annual Register, have all been asked in exam. So, A Tale of Two Cities is less about politics and more about resurrection, love, and moral rebirth. And that's what makes it unforgettable. Now let's move to Great Expectations. Published just a year later, first serialized in Dickens's weekly magazine All the Year Round, and yes, that publication fact is regularly asked in exam. It's Dickens's 13th novel and one of his most perfectly constructed. Even George Bernard Shaw praised it as all of one piece and consistently truthful. Thomas Carlyle, on the other hand, jokingly dismissed it as that Pip nonsense, though he couldn't stop laughing at every new chapter. Both quotes, by the way, have been asked in exam. The novel follows Pip, an orphan raised by his harsh sister and her kind husband, Joe Gargery, the village blacksmith. One day, Pip meets Magwitch, an escaped convict. This meeting, his kindness, and the convict's gratitude become the story's moral heart. Later, Pip is invited to Satis' house, where he meets Miss Havisham, a wealthy recluse frozen in time, and her cold, beautiful ward Estella. Pip falls hopelessly in love with her, a fact that's central to the novel's emotional pull and has been asked in exam. Soon after, Pip receives unexpected news. He has great expectations. An anonymous benefactor wants to make him a gentleman. Believing Miss Havisham intends him for Estella, Pip moves to London, dazzled by money and manners. But as the truth unravels, he learns that his real benefactor is none other than Magwitch, the convict he once held as a boy. Yes, that revelation is a classic exam question. Magwitch returns to London, risking capture, and Pip, though shocked, tries to save him. Estella, meanwhile, marries the cruel Drummel, breaking Pip's heart, another exam-tested detail. When Magwitch is caught and dies, Pip loses his fortune and falls ill. Joe and Biddy care for him, restoring his humility and kindness. In the end, Pip returns home, reconciles with Joe, and meets Estella again, now gentler, wiser, and repentant. The novel ends with a quiet sense of closure and forgiveness, a moment that has also appeared in exams. What's fascinating is that Great Expectations continues to inspire new interpretations. Kathy Acker reworked it in a post-modern version, keeping the same title, while Peter Carey's Jack Maggs retells the story from the convict's point of view. Both facts, yes, have been asked in exam. Let's talk about the final phase of Charles Dickens's career, when his tone became darker, more reflective, and deeply critical of the social inequalities of Victorian England. His last completed novel, and yes, that's been asked in exam, is Our Mutual Friend, published between 1864 and 65. The novel opens with a haunting image, a body pulled out of the River Thames. That grim discovery sets the tone for a story that's part mystery, part social satire, and part love story. The central figure is John Harmon, who's supposed to inherit a fortune from his father, but there's a catch. To get the inheritance, he must marry a woman named Bella Wilfer, whom he's never met. Harmon disappears and is believed dead. But here's the twist, he's alive and living under a false name, John Rokesmith. As Rokesmith, he secretly becomes the secretary to the Boffins, a kind-hearted couple who have inherited the Harmon fortune. Meanwhile, Bella, unaware of his true identity, begins to change from a young woman dazzled by money to someone who values love and character over wealth. A quiet love triangle forms between Bella, Rokesmith, and the life she thinks she wants. By the end, Harmon reveals who he truly is, and the two marry not for money but for mutual respect and affection. The novel closes with peace and renewal, but not before Dickens delivers a sharp critique of Victorian class divisions and greed. In fact, Our Mutual Friend is often seen as Dickens's most mature reflection on how money corrupts both society and human relationships. Now, let's turn to his very last work, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, written in 1870 and left unfinished due to Dickens's death. The novel's very title has been asked in exam multiple times, so note that clearly. It begins with Edwin Drood, a young man engaged to Rosa Wood, living in the small cathedral town of Cloisterham. Everything seems peaceful except for one dark presence, Edwin's uncle John Jasper. He's a choir master with a disturbing secret. Jasper is hopelessly in love with Rosa, his nephew's fiancée, and his passion turns to jealousy and obsession. That's right, Jasper's hidden feelings for Rosa have been asked in exam as well. Worse still, Jasper is addicted to opium, which Dickens portrays in vivid, unsettling scenes. One night, Edwin vanishes mysteriously, and suspicion falls on Jasper. But before Dickens could reveal what really happened, murder or disappearance, he died suddenly, leaving the story forever unsolved. Scholars have debated for over a century how the mystery of Edwin Drood might have ended. Some think Jasper killed Edwin, others believe Edwin escaped and returned in disguise. Whatever the truth, the novel stands as Dickens's haunting farewell, an unfinished puzzle full of Gothic tension and psychological depth. So to sum up, Our Mutual Friend Dickens's last completed novel, with its sharp look at wealth, identity, and love redeemed. The Mystery of Edwin Drood, his unfinished mystery, where obsession, jealousy, and opium dreams blur the line between good and evil. Both works show Dickens at his most introspective, still moral, still observant, but now more shadowed, more human, and more modern.